I don't think that would be his rebellion. I didn't pressure him about stuff like that. Usually. Oh, good milk and cooking. What the hell? Hmm? Yeah. Not red. Not about a red flag. Red nothing. Mm. Oh, yeah. They're not very expensive cars. I don't remember. What is? You know? Like, under 20,000, I think. It's just not like, I don't know. Maybe. Mm. Right? Yeah. Yeah. Mm-mm. Not I mean. He's got a love song. Miracle World Pleasant, he's got more, she's more mouthy. Mm. Whoa. Probably low though. Fuck yourself. Okay. Hmm. I will for it. Yes, sir. Okay. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I don't know if that's all somewhere. Mm. Oh, well, I didn't know what he did. Programming or something. Catch track. Something. That's disgusting. Can I get out of here? Can I get away from them, please? Can you help me tune them out, God? Mm-hmm. 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 I thought you guys were Yugoslavian or I don't know. You were Russian Orthodox, that was your religion. Mm-hmm. Oh.
Okay? The Sears homes reflected mass market taste. Look at all those walls. It's not because people back in the day
to political will, and will there actually be meaningful change? Thanks to both of you for speaking with us on this topic tonight.
Thank you.
And we did ask for an interview with Ontario's Minister of Long-Term Care, Mary Lee Fullerton. Her office did not respond.
Nisga'a Nation that established Indigenous land rights for the very first time.
Well, it went all the way to the Supreme Court of Canada, and it proved that that our people have Aboriginal rights, and that it also meant that Canada had to protect those rights.
Then later, Berger led into a controversial pipeline in the Mackenzie River Valley.
It was a moment of empowerment.
Stephen Kakfwi is a former premier of the Northwest Territories. He says Berger's inquiry gave Indigenous people in the North a say in what was happening around them.
We have a plan. We want to take control of our life. We want to take it back from the churches, from the government. And so what Berger did was he gave us that stage.
Berger and his inquiry traveled to every small community along the Mackenzie River Valley in the Northwest Territories and several in Yukon, hearing hours of testimony. In the end, Berger called for a 10-year halt for the project.
You know, I think if my inquiry did anything 30 years ago was to give Aboriginal people an opportunity to find their voice, to say to Canada, this is who we are, this is where we live.
Tributes to Berger have flooded in, from the Prime Minister to Indigenous leaders. Assembly of First Nations National Chief Perry Bellegarde said, "He showed us why reconciliation would benefit all Canadians." Berger was still working into his 80s, making sure younger generations knew the importance of having their voices heard. He died after a battle with cancer. Thomas Berger was 88 years old. Kay Kyle, CBC News, Yellowknife.
Intensive care beds are filling up. Other provinces and the military are sending help. But Ontario's premier says the problem lies at the borders.
Their federal jurisdiction. And I assure you, if I had the power, I would close down Pearson Airport immediately. I would shut down the land border crossings to only those who are absolutely essential.
Ford wants the federal government to impose mandatory pre-departure testing for all domestic flights into the province. And he wants a mandatory 3-day hotel quarantine for people who cross into Ontario from the U.S. by land.
The borders are broken. We need to fix it.
But data collected by Ford's own government suggests the border isn't the biggest problem. Of the 109,000 new COVID cases detected this past month, just 1,200, about 1%, were travel-related. The rest, overwhelmingly from community transmission or close contact with someone who is infected.
Importation through the borders is extremely low in terms of cases in the country.
Which is why the Prime Minister was cool to Ford's proposals, unwilling to add to the federally mandated layers of tests and quarantines that already exist, instead trying to put the focus on the main driver of new cases.
We have seen that this third wave is very much around community transmission.
It's a message Ontario doctors and scientific advisors have delivered to Ford repeatedly, and repeatedly complain their warnings have gone unheeded as Ontario reopened. Trudeau says it's within Ford's power to severely limit domestic travel in Ontario. He points to the example of the Atlantic provinces and their mostly successful bubble, something done without the intervention or the permission of the federal government. David Cochrane, CBC News, Ottawa.
Right now, demand is still overwhelming supply, as the lineup at this pop-up vaccination clinic in a Toronto hotspot shows.
We're really lucky we managed to get an appointment today.
Many weren't so lucky.
This is what we have, and we're gonna have to make do with it. So I'll be back here tomorrow at 6 a.m.
The national vaccine supply is growing, and it's about to speed up even more. At least 2 million doses arriving each week in May.
What's changed is the massive increase in vaccines in the next few weeks.
That has some provinces opening up shots to all adults.
We are confident now that we can move to the population in general.
Quebec says that will happen over the next 2 weeks. An end to deciding which groups to vaccinate, which the Director of Public Health calls a nightmare.
Now I can say I've got a dream, and the dream is coming true.
He's not alone.
I didn't believe it. I had to pinch myself. I thought this was a dream. I thought I was daydreaming.
Elation from some in Ontario. The province says over the next 2 weeks it will send 50% of doses to COVID hotspots. By the end of May, all Ontario adults will be able to book an appointment for a shot.
We will be able to get it to into people's arms very quickly.
This is potentially a game changer if we do that. In addition to public health measures, this is probably one of the most significant things that we've seen and heard of in months.
Everybody will get their turn.
BC is preparing to speed up too.
Every adult in British Columbia will have access to vaccines by the middle of June.
Hope for better, safer times as Canadians continue to battle COVID's third wave. Catherine Cullen, CBC News, Ottawa.
Today was vaccination day for hundreds of meat processing workers. This Cargill plant wouldn't allow us into the clinic, but did provide these images. 1,600 of its 2,300 workers registered to get the jab.
I was really excited, and ultimately that's kind of what pushed me today to get up and get going.
Cargill was among the first of about 100 meat processing plants targeted for vaccination in Alberta. Another, JBS, is offering a $100 bonus to each of its 2,800 workers who get the shot.
For those that are hesitant when they see their colleagues and coworkers having got the vaccine, and it's simple and easy, and I think we'll expect a batch coming that way.
Early in the pandemic, the Cargill plant was the site of the largest workplace outbreak in North America. Nearly half the workforce caught the virus. 3 deaths were linked to the plant. The RCMP is still investigating a criminal complaint from the family of Benito Casada, who died of COVID last May. Today, Casada's good friend got the vaccine in his honor.
He's my big brother. Always thinking about him.
We had more cases and even some variant cases in January and February, and so they come to work constantly every day wondering if they're going to be safe.
Today, they're one step closer to safe. Doctors say targeting meat plants could be the beginning of a winning strategy.
Could we go to places of worship, for example? Could we go to schools? Could we go to other large employers? I think it's not a one-size-fits-all.
The key, she says, is bringing the vaccine to the people who need it most, but may have the least access. Carolyn Dunn, CBC News, Calgary.
Well,
Looking live at Ottawa here, MPs worked late into the night to pass legislation to end the dock workers' strike at the Port of Montreal. The vote passed just before 2 o'clock Eastern.
Yeas pour 355, 255, nays contre 61, 61.
Je declare la motion adoptée.
I declare the motion carried.
There it was, the moment, 255 to 61, and off it goes to the Senate, which is supposed to be scheduled to deal with the matter tomorrow. But Janice McGregor is in Ottawa today to give us the very latest. Overnight hours, as I said, just before 2. How did this all unfold, Janice?
Well, in the end, Heather, the opposition Conservatives agreed with the point that the Liberal government was making, that this country could not afford to have its second busiest port shut down while the pandemic continues to disrupt and stress out supply chains. Now, the latest dispute with these workers was triggered by a scheduling issue last week. The two sides did have a truce going until last March, but the collective agreement that the dock workers had expired actually at the end of December 2018. So it's been quite a while that they've been due to reach an agreement with their employer. But as Labour Minister Philomena Tassi said last weekend when the government served notice of this back-to-work legislation, the two sides really are far apart. They did have 2 days of what were characterized as last-ditch negotiations on Monday and Tuesday, but the Maritime Employers Association did leave the table late in the day on Tuesday as it became more apparent that it would actually be Parliament that would be shutting down this work stoppage. The Quebec government was on board with this legislation, as was the City of Montreal, both of them putting on pressure. This is the second job action in less than a year by the Montreal Longshore Workers Union. Last summer, a series of single-day work stoppages followed by a 10-day strike cost Canada's economy about $600 million, according to Statistics Canada. Nobody wanted a repeat of that this time, and so, despite criticism from the NDP and the Bloc that the government was being too heavy-handed here, this legislation now moves to end the strike. It will extend the previous collective agreement for a time, but both sides now forced into arbitration to reach a new one.
I mentioned the next stage of this comes tomorrow, comes Friday. Tell us about when this moves on to the Senate, Janice.
Yeah, senators are scheduled to sit very quickly to deal with this bill. The House of Commons only debated this for 2 days before kind of jamming it through. The senators, too, could decide to deal with this very quickly. However, they're under no obligation to. So I guess we'll see if they feel that this has had enough debate and the need for this is clear and apparent enough, or if they do feel it needs some closer scrutiny.
Janice, thank you very much.
The wait is excruciating. Hours on end for precious oxygen to save loved ones struggling to breathe at home. There's none anywhere in Delhi, she says. And then she finds out her wait is over. Her mother has died. The struggle for basic medical supplies is widespread across India and frantic. Volunteers have banded together, a makeshift oxygen army that does the best it can to provide some relief. But a black market has also cropped up, cylinders going for more than 10 times the usual price.
We must have made 1,000 phone calls per hour.
Ruhi Baweja's family struggled to find a hospital bed for her mother. Somehow they did, but
all I could hear was people around her just wailing in pain. They couldn't breathe.
Her mother can't.
There's so much devastation everywhere. It is so scary.
Scary too for the doctors trying to save patients.
You feel very, very dejected at times. When you see a patient, you want to give the best.
But the lack of supplies makes that task so difficult. And so despair mixes with anger that this could have been avoided. India's perfect storm that led to this brutal second wave with more contagious variants was propelled by scenes like these. State election rallies
rallies with large crowds well into mid-April and a slow vaccine rollout.
It was undeniable that India was on the verge of a catastrophic wave of this infection, and yet we really didn't see much policy action.
He warns the official death count is vastly underestimated, and even as supplies are urgently shipped in from allies, relief is far off for India, heaving under the pressure of a virus that won't let it go. Salima Shuji, CBC News, Ottawa.
For nearly a year, Jenny Kim and her husband have been trying to buy a house. It feels like there's not a whole lot of consumer protection for buyers. Kim says listing agents she's dealt with in Ontario broke industry rules, like revealing the price of other offers. It made us wonder, about the legitimacy of these other so-called offers that she had on the table, and whether they were truly higher than ours. So she submitted 2 complaints to the Real Estate Council of Ontario. Over the past year, as prices and sales have climbed across Canada, most provincial governing bodies say complaints about realtors have jumped as well. Some minor, some more major, from allegations of not following COVID protocols to conflicts of interest or breaches of fiduciary duty. This realtor says he's also seen other agents share information about competing bids.
I would say probably 8 out of 10 times the listing agent would give me some hint, and I think that type of thing is wrong.
Ontario's Code of Ethics says when there are multiple offers, the listing agent isn't allowed to disclose the substance of the competing offers. Though in BC, that's up to the seller. Still, critics say the blind bidding process can lead buyers to make higher bids than necessary.
You get in a situation where multiple offers results in emotional buyers overpaying, and then that overpaying becomes the new comparable sale down the street, and then everybody uses that as the next benchmark.
Some say an open auction process would be a win for affordability as well as transparency.
It would forcibly eliminate some of that unethical behavior.
Kim is still waiting for her complaints to be addressed. I really hope that the people who have the power to change and improve things will listen. She's hopeful her family will find a new home fairly. Jacqueline Hansen, CBC News, Toronto.
Johnson & Johnson vaccine has arrived in Canada, but it isn't being distributed, at least not yet. Health Canada is taking a closer look at the first shipment of doses after learning they were processed in a U.S. facility that's been mired in quality control problems. Natalie Collada leads off our coverage once again of all of this. Natalie, what more do we know about the problems and how might they impact us?
Hello, John. Well, the concern here follows 15 million doses of AstraZeneca in the United States that came from a specific plant in Baltimore that were cross-contaminated and therefore ruined. And this is where the 300,000 doses of Johnson & Johnson vaccine that were sent to Canada this week were manufactured. So the government of Canada is taking a closer look to make sure that these doses are all right. In fact, in a statement to CBC, Health Canada said this, take a look here. It said that as with all vaccines imported into Canada, the Janssen vaccines, that those were created by Johnson & Johnson within the company, that's the sub-company there, will only be released for distribution once Health Canada is satisfied that they meet the department's high standards for quality, safety, and efficacy, and this, of course, is not helping concerns about getting everyone vaccinated as quickly as possible in Canada. We know that there have been supply issues as well, John, so this is just the latest thing to have happened.
This, Natalie, as a Calgary-based vaccine maker, says it is leaving Canada. What's the story there?
That's right. The CEO of Providence Therapeutics, Brad Sorensen, spoke to CBC, said he has been trying with his company to develop a COVID-19 vaccine, but he's come rather close, but he's getting, he says, the runaround from the provincial as well as federal government there. He says that he's been working now with the board of directors to move the Canadian company overseas to start developing the vaccines for those in the southern hemisphere. The company did ask the federal government for a loan to help move its trials into the human phase and start a manufacturing site in Canada. Now, we do know that funding requirements and funding given by the federal government for vaccines, it really depends on those that are determined to have what's considered the best chance of developing a viable COVID-19 product. Sorensen said that when he spoke with the vaccine task force, they simply said they had concerns over his ability to scale up quickly. So he says that's what the money would have helped with, but there you have it, John. That's the latest from that front as well.
Thanks for this, Natalie.
You're welcome.
The President of the United States, Joe Biden.
Now comes the even harder part. After spending the first 100 days of his presidency developing a plan to rebuild the U.S. economy, Joe Biden is hitting the road to sell it to voters.
It's a once-in-a-generation investment in America.
Biden has participated in only a few public events like this so far, striking a dramatically different tone in governing from that of his predecessor.
Biden is often called boring, and my answer to that is, if we ever needed a boring president, it's the one following Donald Trump.
Americans seem to like this low-key approach. Biden's approval rating hovers over the 50% mark, while roughly 2/3 of Americans support his handling of the pandemic and the economy. But he doesn't have that kind of support in Congress.
Joe Biden ran as a unifying candidate who would govern in a bipartisan manner, and once in office has governed in a purely partisan manner.
The motion is adopted.
Biden failed to get a single Republican vote for his COVID relief package, and there's little appetite for his plan to raise taxes on the rich and corporations to pay for new social programs. Biden is banking on public support to build pressure on lawmakers to get those proposals passed in Congress.
This is gonna help people in ways that is unimaginable, in ways that will change the trajectory for their children and their grandchildren.
Christina Hawley lives in Philadelphia with her husband and 3 kids. She's a full-time student, and he's a food services worker with an annual income of roughly $40,000. The new and expanded social benefits Biden wants to pass will help families like theirs. Hawley says for the first time, she feels seen by a political leader.
As a black woman in America, it's hard for me to even say out of my mouth that my president is doing a good job for me. And now it's like the American dream includes me.
Support in Congress is unlikely, so Biden needs to look ahead to the 2022 midterms, hoping these proposals will resonate and get more Democrats elected. Katie Simpson, CBC News, Washington.
Chantal Longobardi moved her entire family from Calgary so she could study midwifery at Laurentian University. As a Métis woman, her dream was to help other Indigenous women.
We see obstetrical violence, we see medical racism time and time again, and midwives help with that.
Midwifery is among 58 undergraduate programs Laurentian University cancelled after filing for insolvency. Today, the Ontario government committed to eventually finding another home for the program in the region. Until then, students at Longobardi have been assured they can continue taking online classes at the 2 Southern Ontario universities with midwifery programs. But she says instructors there won't understand the specific social and health concerns that go with giving birth in the north.
When you're talking about reproductive choice and just access to reproductive care in the north, it's a huge loss.
Cutting programs rare or unique to Laurentian is hitting students particularly hard. Cheryl Dito majored in math and minored in English and French literature with a goal to become a teacher. Laurentian's program for educators meant they could become teachers in just 5 years rather than the usual 6, and do so in French.
I was super excited because I would be able to finish school a little bit earlier and I'd be able to do my teacher's college in French at Laurentian. But now if I switch schools, I'll lose that.
And all of Northern Ontario will lose out too, says this department chair at North Bay's Nipissing University.
What we want from universities in part is to educate our citizens and have them stay in our region, to open businesses, to add to the culture, to add to the intellectual environment. When they are forced to move somewhere else, then it is often the case that they don't come back.
Connor Lefortune, for one, doesn't want to leave. He loves his Indigenous Studies program for many reasons, including its proximity to home.
It's also an area that's full of woods and trails and hiking places, so it resembles where I'm from.
While his program is not technically cancelled, it's changing. He learned that many of his courses will no longer be taught by the Indigenous professors who developed them, but alternative classes will be offered instead.
When we look more into it, it's really just an English anthropologist view on Indigenous people, and that's really not what I signed up for.
Lafortune is considering transferring to another university, leaving the area he loves and the people he hopes to one day help as a lawyer, as students' dreams, already affected by the pandemic, take another detour. Tiana Suman-Johnson, CBC News, Toronto.
Without a doubt, vaccines are slowing down infections, but some Canadians who've received a single shot will show up in hospitals with COVID-19.
We do anticipate that there will be cases occurring just because of the fact that the vaccine effectiveness is not 100%.
Not 100%, especially against certain variants. But a large study examining healthcare workers in the UK found that after 2 weeks, 1 dose of Pfizer was 70% effective in lowering the risk of infection, even when variants were rampant. A Public Health England study also found a single dose of Pfizer or AstraZeneca can cut the risk of passing the virus on to others in your household by up to 50%.
Even if it's 1 dose, you are protected and you're protecting your community.
But not for everyone.
I feel more vulnerable all the time.
Alan Silverman has a rare type of blood cancer. He had his first shot 5 weeks ago.
I know my potential for building immunities to this goes down with every day.
That first dose offers our body genetic instructions to build those tiny spikes on the outside of the virus. They show our immune system a piece of the enemy so that it can build defenses to protect us.
The second dose is very important for activating what is called the memory response, immune response, and the long-term protection.
A longer delay between doses often builds better defenses, but not for people with weak immune systems.
As a vaccinologist, I would not expect and not recommend somebody to wait too long if they're immunocompromised.
Giving more Canadians first doses does appear to be paying off. Still, health officials insist not enough people are vaccinated yet. Their advice, keep your distance, mask up, and get your second shot as soon as it's offered. Christine Burak, CBC News, Toronto.
This is about recognizing risk and inequity. A pop-up clinic in Brampton's Islamic Center. 7,000 vaccines will be administered here in the next 2 weeks.
It has been scary knowing that we're in a hot zone, but I think this is a great initiative.
I'm grateful that we actually are getting the opportunity to get vaccinated.
This is part of an accelerated plan to get one shot into most of the region's 1.5 million residents in the next few weeks to get to the most vulnerable.
Brampton is home to a lot of marginalized and racialized folks who are often left out of the conversation when it comes to
Essential workers in Peel, Ontario's manufacturing and distribution hub, are behind the region's crushing COVID rate. People who also often live in crowded housing in multi-generational homes.
The story of Peel throughout the pandemic has been a story of disparity and inequity.
500,000 Peel residents already have their first shot. It's a race to get to more.
I think the urgency is really in trying to ensure that we can actually get to a level where coverage is good enough to keep transmission and to limit hospitalizations and death.
Ontario is now sending half its vaccine supply to vulnerable areas and supporting workplace vaccine sites in Peel. Maple Lodge already started immunizing its employees. Amazon will begin next week. Meanwhile, the pop-up clinic will stay open late most days for those observing Ramadan and to make it easier for anyone else too.
I just attended 2 funerals in the last week and another one yesterday. So we have to get vaccinated. This is the only way we're going to save lives.
And every shot, here especially, is one step closer to safety. Joanna Vermiliotis, CBC News, Brampton.
Gaëtan Verdun is a big city professional, but a camp kid at heart, a love she passed on to her teenage daughters.
I always felt that camp was a really great place to work, to learn to work as a team, to meet new people, to be away from your parents.
So learning that their family's camp of choice in Quebec will not operate this summer has been rough.
My 15-year-old, her mood has changed because she was really looking forward to reconnecting with her friends last spring.
In BC, both of Lisa Cadane's children reaped the benefits of camp, but her son, who has autism, especially so.
We just felt like he had grown in independence and he tried a lot of new things.
But this year, like last, his overnight Easter Seals camp has been turned into a day camp.
The immersive experience is super important, and day camps are great, but it's just not the same experience.
While some camps have made their own decision to cancel or change summer plans, others are awaiting provincial guidance. Jack Goodman has been working on a safety protocol list he hopes will satisfy the Ontario government. Among his recommendations,
we'll keep cohorts separated by the required distances. And if they can't distance appropriately, they'll wear masks. We'll eat more outside. We won't yell and scream and cheer in the dining rooms, but we'll do it outside.
This epidemiologist would also like to see some additional measures to prevent the spread of the virus.
We can use rapid testing, especially on the adults in camps, to make sure they are not transmitting. But the single best way to keep camps open is the single best way to keep schools open, and that is keep it out of the community.
As the community vaccination rates rise as the summer approaches, there is hope. The problem is, decisions about camps need to be made now to give them enough time to set up safety measures. A tough call for any government to make in the still dark days of the third wave. Deanna Sumanak-Johnson, CBC News, Toronto.
Looking live once again at Washington this morning. U.S. President Joe Biden marking his 100 days in the White House with a new message to Americans and using his first speech to Congress last night to tell them their country is on the move again.
Madam Speaker, the President of the United States.
Like other presidential traditions, during his first 100 days in the White House, this one was constrained by the pandemic and security concerns after the January 6th riot. Biden walked through the doors stormed by the mob on that day into an echoing, empty-looking chamber. Just about 200 people in attendance, not the usual packed house of lawmakers, Supreme Court justices, military commanders, and presidential guests. Biden did have a history-making first. There they were, 2 women leaders in places of prominence, Vice President Kamala Harris and Speaker Nancy Pelosi, greeting him and sitting behind him for the duration of his 65-minute address. He heralded American resiliency in the face of the pandemic and political crisis.
We've stared into the abyss of insurrection and autocracy, pandemic and pain. And we, the people, did not flinch.
That is just one short excerpt of, as I said, a 65-minute address that our Washington correspondent Alex Panetta has been analyzing for us live with us this morning, and we always appreciate Alex's journalism after one of these moments. Good morning, Alex.
Good to be here.
You know, talking about investment, once-in-a-generation investment, what Joe Biden was talking about last night has been called transformative. What did you hear in his message that really speaks to the return of the role of government?
Yet another $1 trillion plan. So he's already passed the $1.9 trillion rescue package, pandemic bill. He's proposed another couple of $1 trillion in infrastructure spending to accelerate transformation to clean technology. And this is another proposal that will be close to another $2 trillion. And this is he's calling it the American Families Plan. And what it would do is provide free access to community college. It would provide universal free kindergarten for 2 years, and expand access to public health care. The healthcare details are a bit up there, but it would expand healthcare access.
So, and that, is there anything in particular you want to, from the actual address that illustrates that?
Sure. Well, so what I thought was really interesting is his ode to government. And I called it kind of like an anti-Reagan speech. 40 years ago to the day, on April 28, 1981, Ronald Reagan walked into that chamber and tried to convince Congress to shrink the role of government. He succeeded. Government cut taxes, it cut welfare spending. And last night, Joe Biden extolled government. He said government helped build the Transcontinental Railroad, the interstate highway system, the internet, landed people on the moon, vehicles on Mars, and rolled out vaccines at a record pace. Let's have a listen.
Well, it's time to remember that we, the people, are the government. You and I. Not some force in the distant capital. Not some powerful force that we have no control over. It's us. It's we, the people. In another era, when our democracy was tested, Franklin Roosevelt reminded us, in America, we do our part. We all do our part. That's all I'm asking. That we do our part, all of us.
So listening into all of that and, again, proposing this expansive change, what is he going to need to do? And who is he going to have alongside to make those changes, Alex?
Well, I mentioned Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan had something that Joe Biden doesn't, which is help from his political opposition. I saw a stat the other day that just blew my mind, that roughly 95% of Democrats in the Senate voted to pass the opposing president's signature legislation on tax cuts. That's mind-boggling. That would never happen today. So what Biden's going to have to do is find a way around the simple reality of American politics is you need some opposition support to pass things in the Senate. And my story that you alluded to today has got approximately, lays out 4 paths by which he can do that. None of these paths is easy. All are possible, but he's going to have to figure out which one he's going to take if he wants to pass this expensive agenda.
Try negotiating, use budget reconciliation, weaken the Senate filibuster. It is all there, as you say, the pathways to ending the gridlock. Alex, thank you so much, and what an incredible bookend, 40 years to the day between those Reagan and Biden speeches. Thank you for the time today, and I will direct people to our website to read your analysis in more detail. Again, as Alex says, Biden the anti-Reagan. His speech to Congress calls for the era of more government. It's at cbcnews.ca.
Investigators in Israel are looking into what caused what you're seeing there, a stampede that killed dozens of people at a religious festival overnight. Tens of thousands of Orthodox Jews were gathered in Mount Meron for the annual celebrations that included all-night prayer and dance. At least 45 people were killed and more than 100 others injured. Iris Mackler joins us now in Jerusalem with more. Iris, thanks for joining us. What is the latest?
John, the latest is that in fact all of the wounded have been brought down from the mountain, despite the huge overcrowding there, which police and rescue services did hinder their work. They were quite quick at getting them down using choppers and so forth. But now what we see is enormous confusion because people can't find their loved ones. And that includes children in hospital who don't know where their parents are, and of course vice versa. So people have started doing that dispiriting round from hospital to hospital, and then when you can't find your loved one in a hospital, you go to the morgue. There is one good story about a family that did that looking for their son, and at the morgue they got the good news that he was at home. But there aren't many stories like that, and there is also now the start of the funerals. In Judaism, they tend to bury very quickly. They could bury tonight if it was an ordinary day, but it's the Jewish Sabbath, so we see now funerals starting to get it in before sunset, before the Jewish Sabbath. So still just over 12 hours after the event, a great deal of confusion and chaos.
This as the Prime Minister visited the site and said he will investigate this thoroughly, but at this stage, do we have an idea of what might have caused the disaster?
It's interesting, there were confused reports initially. There was a suggestion that a stand fell down with people on it, but when you look at the video, you see that's not the case. It was overcrowding in this narrow passageway leading to the grave of the sage that they like to pray there particularly. I have heard that there were cries out against the Prime Minister when he arrived, saying, "You've abandoned us and you didn't look after us." I feel that that might not actually be so fair. It's very, very hard to organise, 100,000 people. Any religious event like this is very hard to police. But there is a suggestion that I've heard in the past hour that actually the police set up a block, if you like, a gate at the bottom of those stairs to stop people entering in huge numbers, but that was where people fell, and that's where the stampede happened. So there's a feeling of blame for the police, and the investigation that the Prime Minister has called will have to look into all of that.
Thank you, Iris. Iris Mackler reporting from Jerusalem.
Every person in the Department of National Defense who has been affected by sexual harassment and violence and felt that we were not there to support you. I'm truly sorry.
An apology from the Minister of National Defense today that came with this announcement.
Madam Louise Arbour, former Supreme Court Justice, has agreed to lead an independent external comprehensive review of our institutional policies and culture.
The second review into military sexual misconduct in 6 years. This as the government continues to face questions about the allegations against then Defense Chief General Jonathan Vance about who, what, and when.
My office knew there was a complaint against General Vance. Nobody knew that it was a Me Too complaint.
He either isn't being straight with Canadians, Mr. Speaker, or his chief of staff chose to cover it up and keep him in the dark.
So, what are the political consequences for this government? Is another review the solution to any of this? It's Thursday. I'm with Patty Chantal Hébert and reporting on the Lodge ultimately. I'll start with you, Althea. What did you make of the announcement today? It's familiar, I think would be a generous way to describe it.
I mean, I guess it sounds exactly like what Marie Deschamps offered back in March of 2015, which the government inherited and would have been fully briefed when they came into power. Yeah, it did sound like that. I would say the Liberal government has been very successful at espousing several values, especially progressive values, and this is a case, another case, some would argue, where it has not lived up to those values that they like to preach about. They could have acted on Madame Deschamps' report. He could have clearly just come out, he being the minister, come out and said that they, were sorry that they had not acted on this report sooner, and they were going to implement an independent body that would receive complaints that would be outside of the ensure that that process works better for the victims. I think that the part about the review on the military justice system is a very worthy one, a welcome one by victims, because we know that military justice is not quite the same as the justice system that you would find down here on the Elgin Street Courthouse, where many accusers, even in serious cases of sexual assault, are able to plead to lesser military administrative fines, drunkenness, disorderly conduct, and they escape criminal code convictions. The other thing I think this is really all about, frankly, is this is about trying to take this issue away from the Prime Minister and the Prime Minister's office and about making it about a systemic problem. So a systemic problem that needs a systemic solution. And that's really what we saw today. And the timelines that are many months, maybe a year out, means outside of the election, hopefully for the Liberals, they are trying to bury this, not an issue they want to talk about during the campaign.
It can be true, though, Andrew, that it is a systemic issue and that there are questions the Prime Minister's office needs to answer to involving with all of these things.
Yeah, I mean, an independent investigative body outside the chain of command would have been handy in dealing with, let's say, the complaints against General Vance. But that committee, that body wasn't put in place, though. It was recommended 6 years ago. The report was sitting on the minister's desk. And it would appear that part of the reason it wasn't enacted was because of General Vance. The minister knew going in, or what it should have known, there was at least red flags raised about General Vance's conduct going back some years. He certainly was told 3 years ago that there were complaints against him and did nothing about it. But even more concerning than what happened 3 years ago has been what's been going on more recently. And this issue is no longer about who knew what when, so much as who did what and said what and for what reason in the Prime Minister's office and around them. We know, for example, that not only did Minister Seja not do anything about it, the complaint himself, but he didn't even pass it on to the Privy Council office as he claimed. In fact, what he put his office to was punted over to the Prime Minister's office, who then called it the PCO, who did nothing. So the involvement of the Prime Minister's office, I mean, should not be a surprise. This government, even more than past governments, all roads run through the Prime Minister's office. And that's why it becomes very important to try to figure out why we can't seem to get a straight answer out of people, why we have to drag the truth out of them over a period of weeks, and what in fact was the involvement of the Prime Minister's office going back three years.
What the government says, what the Prime Minister says, what the Minister says, of course, is that they were following the due process, that they couldn't get involved in the complaint in order to allow it to be investigated properly. I am not saying that makes any sense. I'm just saying that is their justification for what Andrew just explained there, Chantal.
So, we have a Liberal leader who campaigns in 2015 on being a feminist and having fired 2 MPs over allegations of sexual harassment, comes into office, finds on his desk a report from a former Supreme Court justice that says that sexual harassment is endemic in the military and that an independent body is needed to handle complaints. That is on the day that you come into office. And then, here we are, 6 years later, appointing a former Supreme Court justice to hopefully not tell us what we already know, and to look into the mechanics of that independent review. And in between, what you have in most generous terms is gross negligence of any word, rumor, noise that there might be issues at the top of the military. Now, this is not a Prime Minister who does not have a report that doesn't tell you that there's a systemic problem. And when his office is seized with notions that there may be something cloudy about his Chief of Defense staff, doesn't think sexual harassment because that's not in the picture. It's in the picture. He has that on his desk coming in. The problem with the Prime Minister this week is that in the House of Commons, his basic defense was, I did the same thing as Stephen Harper did, and yes, he did do that, because that is what Stephen Harper did. He appointed a retired Supreme Court justice to look into it. But he promised coming into office that he would do better. And if you are the Prime Minister and you are in the least bit serious about sexual harassment, there are two institutions that you have some oversight over, the RCMP and the Armed Forces, where you have reports telling you that there is a problem. So would you not be keeping a special eye on anything that is kind of coming to your office? I don't think you can divorce this issue anymore from the Prime Minister by appointing Louise Arbour as Maggie Deschamps' successor to look into this issue.
I mean, I guess I don't understand, just as a regular person, why you couldn't just do something instead of asking for another review. Why you couldn't take one of those recommendations and implement them. And then I guess my other question for all of you would be: does Minister Sachin have any credibility on which to present these ideas, given that he has been the minister since 2015 and has not made any of these moves himself?
Two things I would say. The irony of all ironies is during the press conference, even Minister Sachin said, announcements don't make changes, our actions do. Like, they themselves recognize that they need to live up to these values and that they haven't. There's nothing that prevented them from moving forward on the recommendations that were in Madame Deschamps' report. They could have taken some time to reflect on how they were going to build an outside body, what else they would like to do, how they were going to treat complaints, because in her report she says victims should be able to choose whether or not they want their complaint investigated, how that was going to happen. There were different suggestions percolating in academia and civil circles on how they could do that. So yes, nothing prevented them. The second thing on Mr. Sachin, well, he's in this job because the Prime Minister has faith in him, and frankly, he seems to be doing what the Prime Minister wants him to do. That's why he's still there. Was not given a mandate to create this outside body. Could he have been? Absolutely. Why they chose not to do that, I don't know. I mean, this week in the House of Commons, we learned that more than 700 victims came forward, alleged victims, people with complaints about sexual assault and sexual harassment in the military in those 5 years. And that's a lot.
Yeah, yeah.
And those are the only people who complain.
Yes, exactly. Andrew.
Okay, two things. One is, we know, I think, why they are acting now in this way. They want, as Althea said, they want to punt this past the next election. The best way to do that is to put it in the hands of the judicial inquiry and leave it at that. Nobody can really question them. They didn't do this in response to all the revelations that have come out about General Vance or about other complainants within the military. They did so immediately after it became clear that the Prime Minister's office had been involved in this file. So now that we know that the file that Mr. Sachin didn't want to touch because he didn't want to politicize it was in fact in the supremely political hands of the Prime Minister's office, I think it behooves us to ask why they didn't want to deal with this 3 years ago. And I don't think it's coincidental that this whole thing arrived on Minister Sachin's desk in the spring of 2018 when the Prime Minister himself was under fire, under question for his own sexual misconduct, alleged or otherwise, which he's never really taken the trouble to properly deny. I don't think it's too much of a stretch to say they would not want to have been seen to be taking down the nation's highest military officer over his sexual misconduct offense at the very time when the Prime Minister was under the same questions himself. I think they wanted to make this go away at the time, and they buried it.
Shut up.
I'm not going to go there because Andrew is clear enough on this, but I will point out that there are high political stakes for the Liberals in this, and in their desire to hunt this beyond the next election and be done with it, in the sense that one of the key advantages that the Liberals have over the Conservatives is that they do a lot better, they are a lot more competitive with female voters. And this is dangerous for them. And I agree with Andrew, I don't think that it is all this information coming to light that is suddenly prompting this need for non-action, but rather the fear that it could cost them their edge with female voters.
We're bringing in protections for 3 paid sick days. The federal program runs for 4 weeks. We're there for workers through this entire pandemic. We were disappointed with the federal budget. We thought that they were going to come through, but clearly they didn't. We're stepping up.
Ontario's Labour Minister, Monty McNaught, unveiling his government's plans for 3 paid sick days after many politicians who resist, and then end up doing it anyway. And I'm not sure what that's an indication of.
I can't answer what that's an indication of,
Yes.
but it's a stupid way to go about things. And having resisted for so long, you get very little credit for whatever you do. In the case of the Ontario government, I suspect that part of the resistance came from the fact that when Doug Ford came to office, he cancelled changes brought in by his predecessor, Liberal Kathleen Wynne, that would have granted permanent 2 days of paid leave to people who work in Ontario, amended the Labour Code accordingly, and so did not want to look like they were undoing their own work and shining a light on the fact that maybe they had been too hasty in doing that. But that's, from a distance.
Yeah, yeah.
It might have been a good idea, as it is a fact of life in some provinces, my own, and as far as I can tell, because the argument in Quebec, it's a permanent feature in the Labour Code, 2 days paid sick leave, and the argument in Ontario, the Ford argument, was that this devastates small business. As far as I can tell, small business is surviving in Quebec.
I'll give it one.
Oh, I was just gonna say to that, I think they didn't wanna do that because it's an acknowledgement that, they didn't wanna give him his win, that political win, basically. And also I think ideologically, and Chantal touched on it, they have repeatedly, the Premier has said, he doesn't wanna put that burden on businesses, why taxpayers should carry that burden, I think is a question that should be asked. What struck me is that, in announcing this to great fanfare that these 3 days that the government's going to refund employers for, basically, that this is somehow the best program in the country, I thought, well, poor Yukon, they must feel like completely ignored. They have 10 days paid sick leave during COVID that the government will refund employers for. And when, the public health guidelines say that you should be at home isolating for 14 days, 3 days may not go that far. So, why not look at the Yukon model and see if that's something that could be done?
Even if this was ideological, and I think we probably all would agree that it was, or is, what would be wrong with the government saying, well, we're going to do this temporarily just throughout the pandemic, which is what they've ended up doing? I mean, that doesn't mean that you are leaving your whole principles behind, Andrew. Surely you are allowed some flexibility during a pandemic.
Yeah, I've got nothing against ideology. I do have something against stupidity. There's good reason for them to oppose a permanent mandatory program, because the more costly it is you make it to hire employees, the less likely employers will want to hire them. I think there's good reason to oppose it against a permanent program. But it's a short-term program that the government's going to pay for in the middle of a pandemic. You're trying to make sure people who are sick don't have to go into work, or don't feel they have to go into work. I can't see exactly why they opposed it, except that they didn't want to admit that they were wrong not to have done it in the first place, where we are a year into the pandemic. And they also wanted to pile as much blame as they could on the feds. The feds had brought in this federal sick day leave program, which has turned out to be a bust. It's too complicated, it's too slow to deliver, doesn't deliver enough aid, all these kinds of problems. So for a while there, they were backing and forth about whether they were going to piggyback this federal program. I think in the end, we've got a better result, but way too late in the day.
What was so fascinating, I think, this week is that you found Doug Ford's government, I think, was a predictable position because they've had it for so long, but also you would expect them probably to take that position. But for John Horgan, an NDP premier who had previously been awfully chummy with the federal government, to have the same position, we're not going to do this, we want the federal government to do more. That, to me, was even more surprising than Doug Ford's reversal. Chantal, what did you think of that?
I'm puzzled because it is, as you know, one of the key causes that the federal NDP has been fighting for federally. And that begs the question, why then is the only NDP government in the country resisting the notion that there should be, and I think that would be Jagmeet Singh's rationale, that people should have access to a couple of days of paid sick leave, forget the pandemic, in real time and in the real world. They should be allowed to get sick and be paid 2 days a year. It doesn't sound terribly excessive if PEI
different if you're talking about permanent. Remember, most large employers, unionized employers, already have paid sick days. So you're talking about hundreds of thousands of smaller employers, and somehow the government's going to have to regulate and oversee, and with all sorts of potential for games playing and abuse. So I can understand why in the long run governments would be leery of getting into this. But short term, as I say, it's much harder to explain.
Although, I'm sure everyone's seen this stat, but of the 58% of Canadians who don't have paid sick leave, 75% of those make $25,000 a year. So surely those are the very people who should have access to it, given that they seem to not make enough money barely to survive even. I don't know who wants to weigh in on that. Yeah, Chantal.
And not every business that is not providing sick leave is a corner store with a single owner. There are major corporations, people paid on minimum wage and no pay, 2 days a year, really very excessive, gonna break the bank.
Okay, I'm going to leave it there. Thank you for that conversation too. Appreciate it.
Montreal has been under tough restrictions for months. Inconvenient, but after a brutal first and second wave, some believe necessary.
We made some serious mistake that caused us to take extraordinary measures.
On commence à voir vraiment des réactions.
Quebec's health minister says the province is starting to see rays of sunshine as cases and hospitalizations stabilize and vaccinations pick up.
By May 14, all the population, all the adult population would have been able to take their appointment.
After a warning last month about a possible surge in cases, the tone today was more optimistic.
1 million more doses in a month changes our projections.
Still, to push case counts down,
There has to be a high level of coverage and at the same time good adherence to the public health measures.
and there are a lot of those in Montreal, including a curfew, closed restaurant dining rooms, and a ban on most private gatherings at home. Montreal public health officials say they acted fast to curb the third wave, with extensive contact tracing, testing for variants, and targeted vaccinations in some hotspots.
That's probably what really helped us, that we were ready for this, and that we were prepared, and that people really collaborated.
One expert says it also helps that variants fueling cases elsewhere arrived later in Quebec, with vaccinations further along.
We're not out of the woods, but we are heading in a very positive direction.
Still, just one super spreader event could change everything.
We've learned that reopening too early is not helpful, as we saw when we reopened a little too early in regions outside of Montreal, and then we had cases going really high up.
And with some parts of Quebec still under pressure, the government is watching closely while it works to get more vaccines to more people. Alison Northcott, CBC News, Montreal.
More and more Canadians are finally getting their turn at the shot, and millions more doses are coming. In fact, when it comes to the share of the population with at least one shot, Canada has now surpassed many large countries in Western Europe. But how will we know when we've done enough? Experts say restrictions can loosen when that number gets to around 75%.
It could be anywhere from mid-July to August kind of time frame.
75% may give us some freedom, but not necessarily herd immunity.
We're sort of fixing herd immunity on percent vaccination, but not all vaccinations are equal. We can't be sure that because we have 75% of a population vaccinated, that we have 75% of the population protected.
A lot of the uncertainty is because for COVID-19, scientists still don't know how much antibody response is enough to continue to protect us long term, especially when new variants emerge.
You know that as long as your antibody level is above X, that you're going to be protected. And if a new variant comes, then you can remeasure the X, change it to adapt. And we of course don't know that from COVID yet because we're not that far into it.
Scientists say if we want to get to something that resembles herd immunity sooner, it won't come from vaccines alone. It'll still depend on minimizing risks to prevent the virus from circulating in communities.
So if you have, for example, a population with very, very little transmission, such as we see in Australia and New Zealand, where outbreaks can be detected rapidly, they're nowhere near herd immunity, and yet they can still relax these restrictions because they're
CBC News, Toronto.
Before I get to questions, let me see that shot. You've got your, this is our shot. You're part of this campaign, are you, to remind us to get out there and be vaccinated?
That's right, for everyone to become a vaccine champion in this movement of vaccine confidence. This is our shot, Canada.
That is fantastic. Lots of well-known Canadians driving people to hashtag this is our shot to find out more. So thank you. You'll remind us throughout our conversation this morning. I want to get to viewer questions, and I want most of it to hinge on Johnson & Johnson, because we'll keep coming back to those pictures, those first doses arriving in Canada. Canada now with a fourth vaccine. But I was wondering if we could begin with your thoughts on what makes this particular vaccine different and where you see it's being most useful or applicable.
Yeah, so this vaccine is also a viral vector platform vaccine, somewhat similar to the AstraZeneca type of vaccine. And again, as you mentioned earlier, the big advantage of this vaccine is that it doesn't need ultra cold storage temperatures. It can actually be in a regular fridge for up to 3 months, which is a huge difference compared to the mRNA vaccine. And again, it's only a one-dose vaccine, so it is all about accessibility. So this vaccine can be used in those areas where accessibility is an issue, and we know from already some of our vaccine rollout statistics that we are seeing a lot of inequity in terms of accessibility. So this hopefully addresses some of those issues.
One of the things we know about the J&J, the Janssen vaccine, is the labeling. Health Canada's wanted the labeling change to reflect the blood clots that have been linked to this vaccine, the extremely rare side effects, similar to what we've talked about with AstraZeneca. Just a point from you on that as well, so people can understand what is an extremely rare side effect.
Exactly. So similar mechanism believed to be behind the side effect, this immune response whereby post-vaccine people have some antibodies develop to factor on their platelets that activates the platelets, get them clotting, so having clots, while at the same time these people have low platelet. So it's a phenomenon of low platelets and yet having blood clots, and the same kind of warnings about what to watch for, as we talked about in the AstraZeneca vaccine, the headache, feeling unwell, particularly chest pain, swelling in the limbs, rashes, especially around that 4 to 5 day period after the vaccine, till about day 20 to 24 past the vaccine. And again, and you know, some of the controversies and some of the stop and go parts of the vaccine in the US, and this is what has come out of that. Similar mechanism, similar time frame post, and similar warnings in terms of what to watch out for patients, people who've had the vaccine.
Okay. Thank you again for clarifying that. We do have some viewer questions about side effects. Let's begin with Raj, wondering again, if you look at the side effects of the J&J vaccine and also the AstraZeneca, Raj is wondering, how would that compare to severe side effects of a normal flu shot?
Yeah, so the one thing I want to say about this is that these vaccines and side effects of these vaccines are studied extremely carefully, and all side effects are reported of these vaccines, whereas that's not always the case with some of the other already licensed vaccines. So take fever, for example, after a flu shot, that's not a reportable side effect, whereas for these vaccines, they've looked at all these kind of effects. So we do know that if it depends a bit on what type of severe side effect you're looking at. If you're going to look at some of the quite severe ones, like let's say anaphylaxis, we know that anaphylaxis with a flu shot is about 1 in a million. We know that with some of these other vaccines, especially the mRNA vaccines, can be 4 in a million. Again, back to fever, that seems to be very low incidence post-flu shot, for example, a lot higher with some of these vaccines. We're looking in the maybe 20 to 30% rates, especially after second dose vaccine. So after you've had a second dose of an mRNA AstraZeneca vaccine, and for sure we're seeing some of that with the Johnson & Johnson as well. And again, this vaccine-induced rare clots that can happen seem to be somewhat specific to the Johnson & Johnson AstraZeneca vaccine.
Okay, thank you. So similar symptoms, but maybe a little bit more pronounced in conjunction with the COVID vaccines. And again, you've laid out what you should be watching for in the most rare, most serious of those side effects. Similar to that, you were mentioning with the clotting issue, low platelets comes into play, and Manuel is wondering, for the AstraZeneca and the J&J shot, why not do blood platelet tests beforehand to find out if the person needs a different type of vaccine?
Yeah, so it's a good question, and a lot of people are looking at this kind of approach. Can we do something beforehand to predict who's going to get it? The problem is right now we cannot really predict who is going to get this kind of reaction over other people. And by the time this process starts, it's actually an immune process. So you're going to have the antibodies before you have the low platelets. Therefore, that's a much later effect. And by the time you get there, you would see some kind of clinical symptoms as well, which is why we'd rather people watch for that first, because the low platelets is an after. At that point, this whole mechanism is already in action.
Okay. A couple of questions from Janet and Sarah, and they come back to something that you and I were talking about, and look, I'm still carrying my low-dose aspirin because my mother told me to, even though you told me I don't need to. But both Janet and Sarah were wondering, again, to minimize this risk of blood clots, should we take a low-dose aspirin? I'm wondering why doctors aren't recommending. Can you just go over your message on that and the important thing we need to know about why we don't really need to have this?
Yeah, and I tell you, I've talked to my hematology friend about this because I wanted to make sure that I understand why such recommendations are not made. And there's two things to it. So first, the mechanism, by the time this mechanism is started, aspirin is not going to make a difference. So you actually need an antibody to the antibody and a much more significant blood thinner to once this mechanism has started. So it wouldn't really help post this effect. Before the effect, so in a preventative fashion, again, this is immune mediated. So some aspirin every day is not going to stop that immune process, and any such medications like aspirin come with their own side effects. And if we put everybody who got these vaccines on aspirin, we would have way more severe side effects, such as bleeding from aspirin, than we would actually have vaccine effect.
Okay. Thank you. One quick last question. We got this on email. This is about AstraZeneca. Someone who had severe body aches, pains, fever, nausea, fatigue, all the side effects that you laid out, still fatigued as a matter of fact, and now is worried about getting the second shot. You know, some people aren't going for the second shot. We're hearing reports of that. What do you want to say to someone who maybe doesn't want to go through it again and reluctant to get that second dose?
Your immune system has had a brisk response, so you've had quite a response to this vaccine. In some ways, it's a good thing because it shows that your immune system has seen it and is ready to actually build immunity to the vaccine. We do see more side effects on the second time around because the immune system is even more primed. However, I just want to say it's all about putting it into perspective. Yes, fatigue, headache, fever, it's a problem post the vaccine, and I see how that affects people's lives. But COVID would in a so much worse way, and we know that this particular vaccine, you would still get better protection after that second dose. So you're almost there, and if you need to take some pain medications, do that, but go for your second shot when that's being offered.
Dr. Cora Constantinescu, thank you very much.
Thank you. Have a nice day.
This is about recognizing risk and inequity. A pop-up clinic in Brampton's Islamic Center. 7,000 vaccines will be administered here in the next 2 weeks.
It has been scary knowing that we're in a hot zone, but I think this is a great initiative. I'm grateful that we actually are getting the opportunity to get vaccinated.
This is part of an accelerated plan to get one shot into most of the region's 1.5 million residents in the next few weeks to get to the most vulnerable.
Brampton is home to a lot of marginalized and racialized folks who are often left out of the conversation when it comes to vaccine rollouts.
Essential workers in Peel, Ontario's manufacturing and distribution hub, are behind the region's crushing COVID rate. People who also often live in crowded housing in multi-generational homes.
The story of Peel throughout the pandemic has been a story of disparity and inequity.
500,000 Peel residents already have their first shot. It's a race to get to more.
I think the urgency is really in trying to ensure that we can actually get to a level where coverage is good enough to keep transmission and to limit hospitalizations and death.
Ontario is now sending half its vaccine supply to vulnerable areas and supporting workplace vaccine sites in Peel. Maple Lodge already started immunizing its employees. Amazon will begin next week. Meanwhile, the pop-up clinic will stay open late most days for those observing Ramadan and to make it easier for anyone else too.
I just attended 2 funerals in the last week and another one yesterday. So we have to get vaccinated. This is the only way we're going to save lives.
And every shot, here especially, is one step closer to safety. Joanna Remiliotis, CBC News, Brampton.
A well-known singer, Shraga Gestetner, was born in Montreal, lived in New York. Reports out of Israel say he traveled there for the festival. Today, hundreds of mourners crowded the streets for his funeral. His cousin says Gestetner recently left his singing career in favor of his family.
Jewish weddings take place any night of the week, and was taking him away from his family and other commitments that he had.
He says people who knew his cousin well knew there was more to Gestetner than a singing career.
I have more admiration for his dedication to his family and his 6 children, to his community.
Montrealer Dovie Steinmetz, only 21, was in Israel to study.
Grew up in the neighborhood, same grade as my son, and just a wonderful boy from an incredible family, loving, very social.
This municipal politician says the young man's death has hit his family hard, as well as the tight-knit community.
It's a close unit here, and for the coming days and weeks, this could be very, very difficult for everyone.
There's little surprise there were Montrealers among the victims, given how active the city's Jewish community is in Israel.
They travel to Israel, they have their family and friends in Israel, and now that the tragedy happens, that we are all one.
One today, in mourning what is already being called Israel's worst ever civil disaster. Justin Hale, CBC News, Montreal.
Montreal has been under tough restrictions for months. Inconvenient, but after a brutal first and second wave, some believe necessary.
We made some serious mistakes that caused us to take extraordinary measures.
Quebec's health minister says the province is starting to see rays of sunshine as cases and hospitalizations stabilize and vaccinations pick up.
By May 14, all the population, all the adult population will have been able to take their appointment.
After a warning last month about a possible surge in cases, the tone today was more optimistic.
Really more doses in a month changes our projections.
Still, to push case counts down,
There has to be a high level of coverage and at the same time good adherence to the public health measures.
and there are a lot of those in Montreal, including a curfew, closed restaurant dining rooms, and a ban on most private gatherings at home. Montreal public health officials say they acted fast to curb the third wave, with extensive contact tracing, testing for variants, and targeted vaccinations in some hotspots.
That's probably what really helped us, that we were ready for this, and that we were prepared, and that people really collaborated.
One expert says it also helps that variants fueling cases elsewhere arrived later in Quebec, with vaccinations further along.
We're not out of the woods, but we are heading in a very positive direction.
Still, just one super spreader event could change everything.
We learned that reopening too early is not helpful, as we saw when we reopened a little too early in regions outside of Montreal, and then we saw the cases going really high up.
And with some parts of Quebec still under pressure, the government is watching closely while it works to get more vaccines to more people. Alison Northcott, CBC News, Montreal.
More and more Canadians are finally getting their turn at the shot, and millions more doses are coming. In fact, when it comes to the share of the population with at least one shot, Canada has now surpassed many large countries in Western Europe. But how will we know when we've done enough? Experts say restrictions can loosen when that number gets to around 75%.
It could be anywhere from mid-July to August kind of time frame.
75% may give us some freedom, but not necessarily herd immunity.
We're sort of fixing herd immunity on percent vaccination, but not all vaccinations are equal. We can't be sure that because we have 75% of a population vaccinated, that we have 75% of the population protected.
A lot of the uncertainty is because for COVID-19, scientists still don't know how much antibody response is enough to continue to protect us long term, especially when new variants emerge.
You know that as long as your antibody level is above X, that you're going to be protected. And if a new variant comes, then you can remeasure the X and change it to adapt. And we of course don't know that for COVID yet because we're not that far into it.
Scientists say if we want to get to something that resembles herd immunity sooner, it won't come from vaccines alone. It'll still depend on minimizing risks to prevent the virus from circulating in communities.
So if you have, for example, a population with very, very little transmission, such as we see in Australia and New Zealand, where outbreaks can be detected rapidly, they're nowhere near herd immunity, and yet they can still relax these restrictions because they're able to control outbreaks.
Just when we'll achieve herd immunity is like so much in this pandemic. We'll know when we get there. Vicadopia, CBC News, Toronto.
It really stresses me out when I see all these pictures because this is creating fear, anxiety in our minds.
Millions of people have died. As the days and weeks and months go by, people are going to be worried and that there are going to be more attempts.
Seeing those images of people lying on the street connected to an empty oxygen cylinder, how does that not break someone's heart?
My name is Neha Gupta. I have been immigrated in Canada around 1.5 years ago. My dad, my brothers, my sisters-in-law, niece, nephew, they all are living in Delhi, and I am living here in Canada all alone. My dad, my brother, and my sister-in-law and their 2 children, all of them had COVID.
My name is Haroon Khan. In Pakistan, we have a much lower degree of infection. Having said that, we have personally lost family. We've lost some of our uncles, our aunts, even some of our nephews and nieces to the coronavirus. So it is a real human toll that is being taken.
My name is Sabina Gorhamiller. I am a first-generation Canadian. I moved to Canada, in fact, 20 years ago. My only family that exists here in Canada is my brother. Our entire family is basically in India. We're calling family and friends on a daily basis, seeing how everyone is doing. And then there's that fear when someone doesn't, answer your calls or respond to text messages with, are they okay? Is everything all right? And it's just causes so much anxiety, and I constantly feel like my heart isn't enough the entire day.
When my dad got it, my brother contacted the doctor to get the immediate medications. There comes a day when oxygen level goes down, and it happened with my father and with my sister-in-law also. and my brother kept contacting, and somehow we were able to manage oxygen concentrator on rent for as a backup for emergency.
The issue with having people who contracted coronavirus in Pakistan, they have great medical care for some, but not for all. And so there is difficulty and there is fear. But the images coming out of India are extremely heartrending. It brings tears to the eye. We're all brothers and sisters here.
I think that the most challenging part of some Asians that live in Canada right now is that we are fighting two pandemics. We're fighting one pandemic that is occurring right here and also in India. And it's hard because I feel so privileged because I'm here in Canada and there are millions out there who just don't have that access. And so I feel this immense guilt because somehow I got lucky.
I was feeling like I'm caught in some jail where I can't even help my family. I'm healthy and I can do everything for them, but I was feeling so helpless.
Mosques and community organizations have all thrown hands. People are donating directly to various relief organizations that are on the ground in Pakistan and in India, where this is a flashpoint and people are in desperate need.
My entire family is back in Delhi, and my father comes to visit when he can. And as luck would have it, he was here visiting before the pandemic started and has been stuck here since then. And it's just such a relief for me to have my dad here with us, safe in our house. And I feel for everyone whose families are still elsewhere, still far away.
I just keep saying to my mind that the only thing which at this moment I can do for my family is prayers. Only prayers and have faith in God. That's it.
Pakistan's motto is unity, faith, and discipline. And we're going to have to live it. We'll get through it.
Well, variants are in large part driving the third wave of the pandemic as we know it. New analysis by CBC News has found that as their numbers grew in Canada, many officials either did not notice or did not react with enough urgency to head the variants off. Jorge Barrera is on the story for us, and he joins us from Gatineau. Good morning, Jorge.
Good morning, John.
Let's talk about CBC News and the analysis that we did. What did it show?
All right, well, this analysis basically showed us a tale of two curves. The first curve, the overall COVID-19 case count was starting to drop from its second wave peak in roughly around the middle of January down through February and into the early days of March. And as this curve was dropping, provincial leaders started to loosen restrictions. But in the underbrush, these variants of concern were starting to move. And as they started to move is when provinces decided to loosen restrictions. And here's how an expert from Simon Fraser University described what happened.
People were so used to looking at the total cases and the idea that something small could be rising quickly while the entire picture looked okay because of those 300 or 500 cases a day. Very few of them were variants yet. Or the idea that we don't see a problem yet, or we don't see a problem at all because it's only 10 or 20 cases here and there. But it doesn't take long if they're doubling every week or two for those 20 to become 40, 80, and hundreds quite easily.
Now there's over 100,000 Canadians who've been infected with these variants of concern, and it's hitting young people harder and putting more into hospitals. But
some it'll be guilty with an excuse or excuses, but what happens if you aren't able to meet the deadline?
Right. So we should also say that this is a deadline for those that aren't self-employed. If you are self-employed or your spouse is, you actually have till June 15th to file. However, taxes are due today if you owe them. So if you do need to file today, that is your deadline, and you don't, you are facing a very hefty penalty of at least 5%. And on top of that, 1% per month of compounding interest if you're unable to pay. So if you want to avoid that penalty, you owe tax, it would behoove you to do whatever you can to clear your schedule to try to get that done before the end of today.
Some have deemed it a sort of alphabet soup of government payments and breaks and accommodations that have been made to people over the last year for a variety of reasons depending on your situation. So let's talk about some of those new factors that have gone into the returns this time around.
Right, so many people working at home, this was the big question mark last year. They've had to incur more expenses, utility costs, whatever they were using at home to get through their workday. So CRA for this tax season wanted to really simplify it. Again, John, this is not for those that are self-employed. Things are pretty much the same. They're writing off a portion of their home because they usually worked at home. This is for traditionally employed people that are either salaried or commissioned. And what you want to know is that there is this temporary flat rate method for claiming those work at home expenses. You don't have to provide detailed receipts or things of that sort. It's a simple calculation, $2 a day to a maximum of $400 per year. Now, you do have to meet some criteria. You needed to work at home. You are required to do so because of COVID, or your employer required you to do so. You were working at home for at least 50% of the time and 4 consecutive weeks. Now, $400 doesn't sound like a lot, but that does add up if you and your spouse qualify. Maybe you have an adult child at home too. Now, John, if you say, oh, forget it, you spent way more than $400, especially if you are a renter. Rent is one of those things that you're able to deduct with these new work at home expenses. So if you are a renter and you feel that you certainly spent a lot more than $400 working at home, there is the detailed method. Now with that method, there's a lot more things that you can write off, but you are going to have to prove to Revenue Canada, so you're going to want to keep those receipts. Again, same criteria, had to work at home at least 50% of the time, 4 consecutive weeks. If all of this is sounding like a lot, I know it is, just head to canada.ca and they've got a really great explanation up on there if you should do the temporary flat rate method or the detailed method.
We are, of course, a long way away from life as normal, but let's be optimistic, looking forward to reopening at some point, and we've seen, of course, so many Canadians hit so very hard, some, though, managing to save. So as things open up, how should people think about their spending?
John, we are needing some hope, aren't we? And we've been hearing that as soon as things open up, it will be like the roaring 20s. We're already seeing in the U.S. a lot of restaurants, you can't even get a reservation for weeks because people have that pent-up anticipation. And that is great for the economy. It's great for jobs. It's wonderful for all of us that need to get back into work and into the flow. What I do caution, and I was a contributor in New York when the financial crisis was happening, and the U.S. really learned their lesson when that happened. There were so many foreclosure signs during that crisis. You couldn't help but viscerally get what was going on. Not so much so in Canada. And while we do want to get back to normal, we want to spend, we want to have fun, we deserve to, we want to maybe really, glean and galvanize these lessons that we've learned during this pandemic. The importance of a robust emergency savings account, getting those high interest rate credit card debt paid off no matter what. If you actually had to resort to one of those payday loans,
Thanks for this, Kelly.
Thanks, John.
Kelly Keane, personal finance educator, joining us from Edmonton this week. Alberta Premier Jason Kenney is taking new action to avoid what he calls a hard lockdown. After a week of rising case numbers, his government is bringing in what Kenney calls targeted measures. That could mean curfews for some Alberta communities. The province is now reporting a new single-day record of new COVID.
Turning now to Afghanistan, this morning was the original deadline for American troops to withdraw from the country. ABC senior foreign correspondent Ian Pannell is there with the new timetable and why U.S. forces are on high alert. Good morning, Ian.
Yeah, good morning, Eva. May the 1st was that original deadline. President Biden pushing it back. The Taliban militants here haven't recognised that, and there's fears that they could use the opportunity to try and attack US forces as they leave the country.
Overnight, at least 21 killed, dozens more rushed to hospitals after a suicide truck bomb blast in Afghanistan. It comes as America's withdrawal gets fully underway from today. It fears the Taliban may be preparing for more attacks. America signing a deal with the militants it went to war against.
A return to violence more senseless and tragic. But make no mistake, we have the military means to respond forcefully to any type of attacks against the coalition, and the military means to support the Afghan security forces.
The Taliban now stronger and more confident than at any time since the war began. Here, training for more attacks. Now, all US and NATO forces are leaving by September 11th, ending America's longest war.
After 20 years of valiant valor and sacrifice, it's time to bring those troops home.
For 1 decade since the death of Osama bin Laden and nearly 2 decades since the 9/11 attacks, the US is leaving behind a complicated legacy.
The insurgents are now more powerful than at any time in the last 20 years. This is, in effect, an unofficial border. The edges of Kabul, where government control ends, and just down the road by the Taliban.
Now, a new US Special Inspector General report paints a dire picture. Despite the billions of tax dollars poured in and the years of fighting, insurgent attacks up more than 35% in the first 3 months of this year compared to last year, with strikingly high civilian casualties. And almost half the country now needs humanitarian assistance, double that of 2020.
You know, guys, there's a real climate of fear and dread here, not just about what happens as the troops leave, but for Afghans, more importantly, what happens when they've gone, and whether all the gains that have been made here, especially for women and girls, will then disappear. Dan?
A climate of fear and an uncertain future. Ian Pannell on the ground in Afghanistan. Thank you so much.
Okay, at AT&T, everyone gets our best deals on all smartphones. Let me break it down. You got your new customers, they get our best deals. You got your existing.
To a traffic stop that has led to a federal lawsuit. A librarian in her 60s is suing over an encounter with law enforcement that she says left her injured. ABC's Ellen Lopez reports.
Good morning. The grandmother of 5 says she was on her way from here in Georgia to North Carolina for a funeral. Body camera footage shows officers were behind her for about 10 minutes. But because of the loud music playing in her car, she says she
just woke up from a nap. I don't know how long I was asleep. I thought I heard a knock at the door and then something dropped in front of the doors in the room. I'm expecting my hand fire today. I'm looking forward to this. It's really dry in here. Okay, bye. saw the name Nancy Parker. It wasn't what it was, but it's what God had me see. Nancy Parker. I'm gonna stop recording and upload this.